Number 1.
My grandfather was with the British infantry in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he enlisted. And while he thought that joining the military would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he was never deployed to Tunisia, or Italy, or the Pacific. Instead, he ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. This is just some historical information, but it's important to understand before listening to the rest of the story. Switzerland did its best to maintain a neutral status throughout the war, but regardless of its attempts, Switzerland was highly sought after by both the Allied and Axis forces. Once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss army. Yet in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its army, and subsequently the British reinforcements, to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps mountains. And that's how my grandfather found himself stationed in a remote village in the Alps. At this time it was early in the winter of 1943, and my grandfather's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. Part from the advantage they had with this location was that it was really hard to get to, and therefore had little chance of being spontaneously invaded by Nazi Germany. But there was also a disadvantage, because it made communication with the rest of the Swiss army very difficult. The issue with communication was further compounded when sometime in early December, a series of blizzards swept through the region and completely destroyed the few lines of communication they had in the first place. So essentially trapped in this isolated Swiss village without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandfather's captain decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Any roads to the outside world were buried in about 7 to 9 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph or phone lines they had were equally useless. It grew deeper into the winter, the leaves were stripped from the trees, and the bared tree trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. The town was nestled between 2 large mountains. Sunlight only directly reached the town for a few hours each day, making the soldiers feel as they were living in a state of perpetual dusk. One night my grandfather was at the town bar with a few friends from his company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, and none of them were used to having the Brits around, so one of them began shouting in broken English, "Where take you the children?" Luckily, one of the guys my grandfather was drinking with spoke fluent German and was able to act as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of confusion and yelling, the translator turned to my grandpa. "They say that some of the village children have gone missing. They want us to do something about it." Now obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act like a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandfather and his friends told the villagers to come back to headquarters, really just a makeshift barracks that they had thrown together in the town's church, so that they could bring this to the captain's attention. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took about 2 hours, and basically what the captain and his self-designated translator were able to piece together was that a few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals noticed there was a variety of bizarre occurrences. At first, it was just stuff like vanishing pieces of wood and tarp from people's sheds, but over the following 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, that was a handmade ceremonial halberd, sort of like a traditional war axe, had disappeared from his fireplace mantle. The culmination of all these occurrences was when a village child went missing. Of course, many assume that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as a boy falling into a snowdrift, or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or another predatory animal. But there wasn't just one child that disappeared. The villager who entered the bar who looked especially upset, that was the father of the 2 young boys who had gone missing 2 days prior. He searched everywhere for them, even rounded up a posse of his fellow townsfolk to join in the effort. But they couldn't find a single clue as to what happened to the children. The captain told the villagers he would continue to look into the matter, and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night, looking for whoever or whatever was the culprit behind the strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy, full-grown man on its own. Naturally, rumors began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were young kids between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the original 3 kids that had gone missing, 7 children vanished from the town. Many people in my grandfather's company were growing suspicious. One explanation that got passed around was that the impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers for extra cash, but even that didn't make any sense because the roads into and out of town were still blocked by the snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. At this point, it was early spring, and the snow was starting to thaw. Coincidentally, when my grandfather was on patrol with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the disappearances. It was some time past midnight when my grandfather and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandpa was at the opposite end of the street, so at first, the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. My grandfather and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and they immediately tore themselves away from the window and began to run away. Everyone in the patrol was certain that this was what was behind the disappearances and break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming at whatever it was to stop. They kept running and running, and soon they found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep. The figure jumped into the ground. It looked like it had vanished into thin air, but as the patrol grew closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of the snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out and show itself, several gunshots exploded out of the entrance of the snow cave. My grandfather and the rest of the patrol shouldered their weapons and began firing into the hole. They waited for what seemed like hours, but it was only just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down, and crawled into the cave. Several seconds later, he emerged with a completely horrified expression on his face. My grandfather took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave. When he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange occurrences in the town, the figure they had been chasing was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks before. They shot Reginald straight in the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, but also the bodies of 7 partially eaten children. Either due to stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or some sort of terrible mental issue, Reginald had gone completely insane and begun breaking into villagers' houses and snatching children from their homes in the middle of the night. He had used the halberd that had been reported missing to dismember the bodies. After he slit the children's throats and then hid them in the cave he had carved into the snowdrift.
Number 2.
My grandfather recently died. He was a World War II veteran and was one of the many to push into Germany. He died from liver cancer, which went undetected until the final weeks of his life. Shortly before he died, he called me and asked me that I come see him. When I arrived, he cleared the room and told me this story. I don't know what to think of it, but I can assure you my grandfather's liver cancer did not affect his ability to think, reason, or recall information. What follows is his story. I have paraphrased some things and altered a few words to make his meaning more clear, but I have not changed the narrative of this story. Just before the war ended, we were ordered to capture this little town that we thought might have some POWs or civilian prisoners. It wasn't big enough to have a big camp, so our best guess was that it was for high-ranking members of the military that had been captured. I'm not going to tell you the town or the specifics of the guys I was with at the time, but we were told that there weren't going to be many German soldiers in the town and to take as many prisoners as possible. Obviously, that plan wasn't quite followed through when it really hit the fan. It turned out they had a few tanks in the town as well as some more elite soldiers. Most of them were killed when we took the town, and most of the ones that were captured refused to talk. Pretty soon, after we took the town, we found out that there was a research center built into the side of a mountain. There was no way of getting into it without some high-powered explosives or somebody inside deciding to open the doors. It was built to look like an old mine until you got into it. Then there was a massive steel bunker door. Rumors started up that there was some real fucked up shit going on behind those doors. Not the run-of-the-mill stuff we'd learn about, but really fucked up shit. We heard from the captured soldiers that it was an occult research facility. We got orders to starve out whoever was inside, so we just sat on our asses for the better part of 2 weeks waiting for the doors to open. I was on guard when the fuckers inside decided that they didn't want to be inside anymore. I was with the 3 of the guys sitting at the entrance to the bunker when the doors opened. It started as distant screaming. Just like somebody was being burned alive. Just constant screaming. We had no idea what was going on. Everybody jumped up and started looking around. Our first thought was that we were being attacked. That's when things started to run out of the bunker. The first one I saw looked like an emaciated naked man. If you see the photos of the concentration camps of how the people were like skeletons, that's what this poor fuck looked like. Except he was covered in mangy, gray hair and oozing red sores. At that point, nobody knew what went on in the concentration camps, so seeing this guy was a real shock for everyone present. The guy stumbles out, moaning and wailing, and he trips and falls over, and I see another guy behind him. This one. Fuck. This one looked like him, but just a whole lot worse. There was a tangle of wires coming out of his arm, and half of his skin was missing. The skin that was on him, it was yellow and blue gold veins running up and down. The third one didn't even have any skin. He was just muscle and bones and ligaments. There wasn't any eyes, just glowing red dots in his face. Then, the monster started coming out. Something that looked like a dog with a giant spider's legs sewn onto its back. Then I saw the man covered in bone plates and reminded me of a crab. Then there was something that... it was morphing constantly. 1 second, it was a hazy purple frog with limbs coming out of the wrong angles. Then it was a hunched man running on all fours. Then it was just a mass of flesh and teeth. It was like television static given life and tangible mass. Then there was something that was a wolf with a man's legs and arms, and it was babbling nonsense words. One of the guys I was with panicked and started firing into the bunker, but the things inside that had never been human just ignored the bullets like it wasn't even a big deal. Like the guy was shooting a potato gun at them. Something that looked like a floating squid with a torso vaguely reminiscent of a man and so many eyes I couldn't even count them all out. Its limbs were flailing like snakes and it bowled over to me. I hit my head when it knocked me down and I blacked out for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, somebody was dragging me backwards, and men in black armor were coming forwards and capturing things. It didn't make sense to me at the time that we could feel these things and lead them and they could shrug it off. But these men could tackle them down and haul them off. But I realized that these men knew what they were doing. I think they'd seen this shit before and they were the guys you called to deal with it. I was pulled around a corner and it all went out of view. I heard later that when they went to the roundup, whoever was left hiding inside, they found rooms of slaughtered corpses and men hanging from meat hooks. The men in the black brought in some regular army men to help them sweep, and I heard this all from one of them. He told me that there was a room that had limbs and organs and heads and skin all wrapped in separate bags and freezers, like they were pieces to a human jigsaw puzzle. There was a room that they found an emaciated scientist in, and he'd written on the walls formulas and theories and equations. There was a whole wing filled with cages and monitoring equipment, all of them busted open or unlocked. The guys seemed to think that there were two parts to whatever was going on in the facility. The first part was trying to turn men into monsters, or make men that could be disassembled and reassembled at a whim. The second part was trying to get the monsters and whatever else they had in there to cooperate with them and to turn them into soldiers. He had a theory that the human guards, or the humans inside, had somehow managed to convince the monsters to cooperate with them and escape. And when the door opened, they all just ran out trying to get away. I think somebody probably forgot to lock a door, or somebody slipped up and didn't check all the boxes, and some of the monsters got out and caused enough havoc to let the humans inside open the door. Then they all just bolted. After the war, there was a big cover-up attempt, because a lot more useful German scientists that had been working for Hitler were given pardons and citizenship with the stipulation that they assist the US government. Some names got out, but nobody really cared too much at the time. We were all high on victory and the economic boom that happened when everybody got back. And that was the end of my grandfather's story. He died a few days later, and as per his wishes, he was burned instead of buried. For some reason, I got his ashes. He's sitting on my table right now, in a little copper urn.
There's always a reason to be afraid.